The Coxwain of the Lifeboat by R.H.Malden and read by Christopher Halton. Tonight's tale takes us to the lonely Suffolk coast, where the sea has long been both benefactor and executioner. In a quiet church stands a memorial to men whose courage wrested hundreds of lives from storm and shipwreck. Their deeds are remembered with gratitude, their likenesses preserved for future generations. Yet memory is a curious thing. Some histories refuse to remain safely confined to church walls and fading records. There are occasions when the past seems determined to step beyond its frame, and when those long-thought dead appear unwilling to surrender their claim upon the living. In The Coxwain of the Lifeboat, R.H.Malden combines the rugged traditions of England's lifeboat service with the subtle supernatural touch that made him one of the finest heirs to the school of M.R. James. What begins as a local curiosity gradually deepens into a haunting meditation on duty, sacrifice, and the uneasy relationship between remembrance and oblivion. This is one of Malden's more evocative tales because it draws upon a very real tradition of coastal heroism. The contrast between the nobility of the lifeboatman and the quiet unease that gradually enters the story gives it a distinctly Suffolk atmosphere, part sea story, part ecclesiastical ghost tale. So settle back and listen carefully. Beyond the churchyard, the wind is rising over the North Sea once more, and somewhere in the darkness an old crew may still be answering the call. There is upon the coast of Suffolk a church which is locally believed to be haunted. The rector is a friend of mine, and as I do not want to expose him to the attentions of the phantasmagorical associations or any similar body, I will not describe the place particularly. I will only say that the church is a large building in the perpendicular style of architecture, constructed of grey flint. The neighbourhood is popular with artists. If these details are sufficient to enable anyone to identify it, he is entitled to any reward for his ingenuity which he can secure. The ghost has never, so far as I know, had a name put to him, and nobody knows anything of his antecedents. He has never actually been seen, but he may be heard very often. He dances and chuckles, not upon the whole malevolently, but is always careful to keep a pillar or some equally solid object between himself and his audience. He is very agile, and no one has ever succeeded in cornering him. It is on record that once, when the sexton was locking up, he chased the ghost, who was being noisier than usual, from pillar to pillar all down the nave, then up the tower staircase as far as the belfry. Still there was nothing to be seen. By this time the sexton was hot and out of breath, so he said rather crossly, "Hey, what are you a-sniggering at?" A clear voice from amongst the bells replied, "It's not funny enough for two." The rest, as Hamlet once remarked, is silence. If the story of what befell me a good many years ago within sight of that church is not interesting enough for two, I must apologize. But I think it sufficiently out of the way to be worth putting on paper. There is no anchorage within 30 miles, and about 4 miles out there is a maze of sandbanks. The church is not particularly rich in monuments, but near the font there is a mural tablet worth attention. It commemorates the crew of the lifeboat from 1850 to 1869. During those years they underwent no change and rescued no less than 452 shipwrecked mariners. That particular stretch of coast is still, I believe, regarded by seafarers as unusually dangerous. There is no anchorage within 30 miles, and about 4 miles out there is a maze of sandbanks. A sailing ship which gets among them in bad weather is lost, and even a steamship finds escape difficult. There has been talk of putting a light there more than once, but nothing has come of it. When there was more coastwise traffic, for the most part in small brigs, than there is now, the calls upon the lifeboat must have been incessant during the winter months. After 19 years of beneficent activity, I'm quoting from the tablet, disaster came. On October 31st, 1869, the boat was lost with all hands. No bodies were recovered except that of Henry Rigg, the Coxwain. I had often wondered what lay behind this. Had they gone on too long and allowed familiarity with danger to blind them to the fact that they had become too old for the work, as is said to be not unknown in the case of Swiss guides? Had the Coxswain's nerve and judgment, upon which everything depended, failed at some critical moment? Although it was unlikely that anyone would ever be able to answer these queries, I put them to myself more than once. For some reason which I could not explain, I felt sure that there was a story behind this catastrophe which removed it from the category of ordinary hazards of the sea, and I wished very much that I knew what it was. Irrational as I knew the desire to be, it refused to be dislodged. In fact, it became stronger every time I saw the tablet. One day when I was wandering, rather aimlessly I must admit, in the churchyard, I suddenly found myself opposite Henry Rigg's grave. I don't know why I had never thought of looking for it before. Perhaps I had assumed that in view of his station in life there would be no headstone, or at least a small and inconspicuous one which would be difficult to find. In fact, it was a large and massive slab of the pink granite, which was popular for such purposes about the middle of the last century. Personally, I have always thought it one of the ugliest monumental materials known to man, especially when it is polished so highly that it looks wet. There is a striking example in the memorial to the OWs who fell in the Crimean War outside Dean's Yard. In 1869 it must have been about the most expensive material which could be procured. The inscription was brief: "In memory of Henry Rigg. For 19 years, Coxwain of the Lifeboat, who was drowned with all his crew off the Anchor Shoal, 31st October 1869, aged 62 years. When thou passest through the waters, I will be with thee." There was no suggestion that the stone had been erected by public subscription. Had it been, the names of the crew would have been recorded. I concluded that the Rigg family had paid for it and wondered idly how they had managed to find the money. This led to some reflections on funeral expenditure in general. These might have been prolonged considerably and even have reached a pitch of moral elevation sufficient to justify their committal to paper, had I not had a sudden feeling that there was somebody close behind me. Of course, the churchyard was a public place, and anyone might have come up without my hearing his step upon the grass. It might be somebody who had some business with another grave, or an idler like myself who wondered what I was staring at so intently, and had allowed his curiosity to get the better of his manners. Nothing could be more reasonable than either of these hypotheses, but all the same I was conscious of a feeling of discomfort, almost of alarm. I turned round quickly, but there was no one there. I think this disturbed me quite as much as any presence, however malevolent, could have done. I had felt so certain that there was someone. However, as there was nothing to be seen, I walked away. When I had gone a little distance, I glanced back. It was between 3 and 4 on a November afternoon, so the light was failing. But for a moment I could have sworn that there was an animal of some kind, either a black cat or a black dog. I couldn't see which, sitting on the grave. It was gone in a moment, whatever it was. "Some trick of shadow," I said aloud, more to reassure myself than because I believed it, and walked on, perhaps a little more briskly. I did not look behind me again, and was glad when I was out on the high road, and only a few hundred yards from my inn, the flood tide. I had stayed there often before, and was on good terms with the landlord. If business was slack, I would sometimes ask him into my sitting room after supper. He knew a good deal about the neighbourhood, and was seldom reluctant to impart his knowledge. In perpetuity he might have been a bore, but as an occasional visitor I found him very good company. I told him that I had come upon Henry Rigg's grave in the churchyard that afternoon. "Ah," he said, That's a fine stone. Must have cost a deal of money to put that up. Yes, so I thought. Did his family pay for it, or was there a public subscription? No, sir, it were not his family, for he hadn't none. Never married and kept himself very much to himself, if you take my meaning. When he die, a lawyer chap come over from Saxmonham and say he were executioner for the will, and he have the stone put and choose the text. No, there were no talk of any subscription, for he were not liked. No, he were not. They couldn't hardly get bearers for the coffin, I believe, and there was some as said he didn't ought to be buried in the churchyard at all. But rector, he didn't pay no heed to they. All he say were, well, he'll be safer there than anywhere else, I do suppose. And so it were done. But no, he were not liked, not even by his own crew, though he were a good seaman, to give the devil his due, as the saying goes. The last 4 words seemed to be added hurriedly as an obvious afterthought. At this point a servant knocked at the door and said that the landlord was wanted in the bar. I have not mentioned that his name was Rust. He went off, not altogether unwillingly, I thought, and about half an hour afterwards I went to bed. Sea air always makes me sleepy. The next 2 or 3 days were unusually fine for the time of year, and I spent them bicycling about the country. I was taking a belated holiday, having been kept in London all through the summer months by a book which I was writing, an occupation which necessitated frequent and lengthy visits to the library of the British Museum. The manuscript was now in the hands of the printer, and I felt that a change of air and scene would equip me to deal with the proof. I took care not to go near the part of the churchyard where Henry Riggs' body reposed. This seemed to me to be a wise precaution, though I must confess that I felt rather ashamed of myself for adopting it. All the same, I thought I should like to elicit some more information about him. So one evening I invited Mr. Rust to join me again. After a little miscellaneous conversations, I came to the point. I think he was expecting me to do so. Well, sir, he said, I don't know as I can tell you much more. I were only a lad at the time. You could, but don't mean to, was my unspoken comment. But by what I've heard, he was a close-fisted old chap, and then his language. The fishermen aren't so particular as what you or me have to be with a position to keep up. But they do say that the way he went on at his boat's crew was like nothing, if you take my meaning. They wouldn't have stood it but that he were a good seaman, and you don't find them under gooseberry bushes neither, no nor yet on apple trees. And he live all alone with one big black cat what were fierce enough to scratch your eyes out. And nobody knowed what he did to pass the time away, except that he were never seen in church. And then when he die and it come out that he had a mortar money in the bank at Saxmonham, well, that made more talk. How'd he come by it, and why didn't he spend it? That's what people wanted to know, but the lawyer wouldn't tell 'em, and the bank wouldn't tell 'em, so they was as wise as they begun. What happened to the money? I asked. Why, he left it all to an old lady somewhere, Acle way, but she hadn't hardly got it when the house where she lived all alone got on fire, and she were burned dead to a cinder, so she didn't get no good by it neither. And as she were intestate, what they term, and hadn't no relations, Queen Victoria took it. There was some as thought she did ought to be warned, but I never heard that it done her no harm. You'd have thought she had pretty nigh enough already, wouldn't you, sir? But there, she had a long family to put out, and a widow woman too. There were an auction of Riggs' bits of things, but nobody wouldn't bid for 'em, not a penny piece. So the lawyer chap he have them taken away in a cart, and the man what drove the cart slipped somehow, and the wheel went over his leg and broke that in 2 places, went lame all his life, he did. Then nobody wouldn't take the house till the agent he got some strangers, and they didn't stop no more than a week. So then Lord S., what own all this part, he say, pull that down, and it were done. There's been nothing of it these many years, except a few mounds just outside the village. The old people say it's no place now, especially after dark. But that's as may be for what I know. Well, I said, he must have been an odd character. Is there anyone left who could tell me any more about him? Mr. Russ looked at me for a moment without speaking. Then, odd, well, yes he were. And if I was you, sir, I'd leave it be so, but there's old Dan Ricks what were in the Coast Guard when that happened. He come up here now and again, and if you was to stand him a pot of beer and a screw of tobacco, he mought get talking, and then again he moughtn't. Luckily, Mr. Ricks honoured the flood tide with a visit about noon on the following day. I was in, as I had happened to have a number of letters to write. An introduction was effected without difficulty, and I followed Mr. Russ's advice with good results. I will summarise the story I got in my own words. Yes. He had known Henry Rigg for several years, probably as well as anybody. Nobody knew him well, he did not like him, nobody did. But as Coxwain of the Lifeboat there was no one to touch him. He, Ricks, remembered the day of the disaster very well. He was wakened about dawn by the distress signals of a ship. One of the worst gales he ever remembered. Wind northeast by east, the most dangerous quarter. The lifeboat was launched as quickly as possible, Rigg swearing and cursing more than usual. By the time the boat was away, it was quite light, so he watched through his telescope. The ship was a small brig. Foreign certainly, perhaps Russian. She was on the anchor shoal and didn't look as if she could last an hour. He could see the men clinging to the rigging. There was a very nasty sea, but Rigg's steering was wonderful. The devil himself couldn't have bettered it. One funny thing he noticed. More than once he could have sworn that there was someone sitting beside the coxswain. Must have been the way the old boat cloak he always wore was blown by the wind. All went well until the lifeboat was nearly up to the distressed ship. Then all of a sudden the helm was put right over. The boat broached and was gone in a moment. This was before the days of the modern self-righting boats. I have omitted some maritime technicalities with which the story as told to me was embellished. It will be enough to say that the act amounted to murder and suicide. A shore-going equivalent would be for the driver of a car to turn it off the road at 50 miles an hour. The ship went to pieces a few minutes afterwards. There were no survivors, and nothing by which she could be identified ever came ashore. Curious, I said, that Rigg himself, who seems to have been entirely responsible for the disaster, was the only one who, well, I can't say escaped exactly, but lived, if you can put it that way, to receive Christian burial. Mr. Ricks took a long draught of beer and put down his empty mug. Ah, there's some as the sea can't drown, and others as it won't keep. With which oracular utterance he stumped off. After lunch the wind had risen considerably, so I thought that a walk would be pleasanter than a bicycle ride. I would go northwards along the top of the low sandy cliffs and return with the wind behind me along the beach. The tide would not, I knew, be high till 6 o'clock, so there would be a strip of firm sand available. I walked for a little over an hour, and it was past 3 o'clock when I turned down to the beach and set my face for home. There was every prospect of a stormy night, and the white water on the anchor shoal was very visible under a grey and lowering sky. Naturally, my mind ran on the story I had heard. Local opinion evidently held that there was more in it than met the eye. But what more, it seemed unlikely I should find out. It was solitary down there. On my right hand the cliffs were high enough to cut off any view inland. On my left lay the sea. Some 3 miles in front there was a small projection. You could hardly dignify it by calling it a headland, screening the village for which I was bound. Naturally, I had the beach to myself. No one was likely to be about in the gathering dusk and rising storm. On the whole, I was glad of that. The company, or even the sight of another human being, might be welcome. But on the other hand, there might be people about whom I should not care to meet. Once I thought of turning up to the top of the cliffs again, but that would be rather silly, and the particular stretch which I was passing then did not look very accessible. I certainly wasn't going to turn back to where I had come down, so I held on. Presently I saw a figure some little distance in front of me. He was standing at the very edge of the water. I was surprised that I hadn't noticed him before, and allowed myself to wonder for a moment whether he had just come up from the sea. But of course that was nonsense. He must have been sheltering, resting perhaps, on the lee side of one of the groins which crossed the beach at intervals. I could not make out whether he was going in my direction or coming to meet me. After a time I saw that he was walking up and down, like a man keeping an appointment. An odd and uncomfortable rendezvous, I thought, and no one else in sight. I hope he isn't waiting for me. I did not like his look, so decided to strike up along the shingle until I had passed him, though it meant heavy going and climbing the groins, instead of turning them at the seaward end. When I got a little nearer, I saw that he was dressed like a seaman of the last, by which I mean the 18th century. In fact, he reminded me of the illustrations in a copy of Treasure Island, which I had had when I was a schoolboy. He wore a three-cornered hat, a boat cloak wrapped round him, and sea boots. But for the fact that he had 2 legs, he might have been Long John Silver himself. His hat was pulled down over his forehead, and the collar of his cloak turned up. Naturally enough, as the wind had risen to nearly a gale, and was very cold. I could see nothing of his face, for which I was thankful. There was something indescribably sinister, worse than sinister, downright evil about him. However, he took no notice of me. I looked back once or twice when I had passed him to make sure that he was not coming after me. The last I saw of him, he was still pacing up and down. When I got round the little headland, there were, as usual, a number of fishing boats drawn up near the bottom of the slipway which led from the beach to the village. As I made my way through them, I received the impression that there was somebody dodging about among them, but as the light had now failed considerably, I could not see him distinctly. In fact, I could not be sure whether there was anyone there or not. But I thought so, though whenever I looked steadily at the point where I had seen him last, there was nothing. Anyhow, whoever he was and whatever he was up to, it was no business of mine, and I did not feel called to interfere. Pusillanimous, perhaps, but if, as I more than half suspected, he had an appointment to keep in the direction from which I had come, interference on any pretext would not be likely to be very fruitful. I won't pretend that I was not more than ordinarily glad to find myself safely back at the flood tide. After tea, I settled down to read that grim, if entertaining work of Anatole Lebras, La Légende de la Mort en Basse-Bretagne, which was one of the few books I had brought with me. The inn-library consisted principally of Sunday school prizes acquired from time to time by various members of the House of Rust. From one standpoint, the collection was very gratifying, but except for little Henry and his bearer, which I was delighted to meet again, it was not in the first rank as literature. For the moment, at any rate, I preferred the sombre stories of Anatole Lebras. Now, the reader who gets as far as this may assert, when he has heard the rest of what I have to say, that I fell asleep. I cannot prove that I did not. I can only say that I repudiate the suggestion entirely. I know that I did not. Even if I did, my dreams would not be easy to account for. Quite suddenly I seemed to be looking through the pages of my book at a scene beyond. Every detail was very sharp, though the whole picture was on a small scale. It was exactly like what one used to see in the camera obscura when I was a child. Some ingenious arrangement of lenses and mirrors too, I suppose, threw a picture of what was passing outside onto a table in a darkened room. I suppose such a thing hardly exists now. It could not hope to compete with the films, though as a matter of fact I came upon one only about 10 years ago in a queer old house in Edinburgh, not far from the castle. The first thing I saw was a sandy beach. The light was beginning to fail, and there were unmistakable signs of gathering storm, plainly a reproduction of what I had looked upon not much more than an hour before, and here was the queer, sinister-looking seaman whom I had passed. As before, I did not see him come. He was suddenly in the picture, walking up and down. I was intensely interested, as I felt sure that the other party to the appointment would make his appearance before long. I was right. After not more than a minute or two, I saw someone coming from the direction of the village. He kept as close as possible to the bottom of the cliffs, which suggested that he was anxious to avoid being seen. That part of the beach consisted of loose shingle, and if there is worse going than loose shingle to be found anywhere in the world, I should like to know where and what it is. I will not dispute the abstract possibility. I merely repeat, I should like to know where and what it is. He came on slowly, and presently the old seaman saw him and stood still near the seaward end of a groyne. When the newcomer reached the landward end, he turned and ran down it with surprising speed, bending double. He would have been quite invisible from the far side, and not easy to pick out from the other, or from the top of the cliff. The general effect suggested an animal rather than a human being, and was extraordinarily repulsive. He seemed to be dressed like a fisherman, but as he too had a boat cloak wrapped about him, I could make out no details. I could not see his face. He struck me as unusually short, almost a dwarf, and I thought he was slightly humpbacked. When the two men met, they spoke a few words, which of course I could not hear. Then something which looked like a small bag changed hands. The second man stowed it somewhere about his person and started to return as he had come. Then everything became dark and I could see no more. I felt sure that there was more to come, so waited. Looking down at the pages of my book, I did not have to wait long. The next picture was the living room of a cottage, rather larger and better furnished than the average, but not particularly noteworthy in any way. In the middle of the room was a small round table above which hung an oil lamp. There was a good fire of wood and coal on the hearth, and I noticed the little blue flames which old ship timbers always give off. Whether this is due to the salt which they have absorbed, or to the tar, or to both, or neither, I cannot say. Between the table and the fire, a man was sitting in an easy-chair, smoking a long clay pipe. Beside him on the table was a long tumbler, nearly half empty, from which an inviting steam went up. I had no doubt that this was the second man I had seen on the beach. Now that I could see him plainly, I saw that I had been right in thinking that he was almost a dwarf, and if he were not actually humpbacked, very round-shouldered. He was swarthy, almost as if he had gypsy blood in him, and his face was not a pleasant one. It was mean and sly. At the same time, however, the jaw suggested courage and determination. I could not decide whether I should dislike him more as a friend or as an enemy. His surroundings were comfortable enough, but it was soon obvious that he was ill at ease. From time to time he fidgeted in his chair and seemed to mutter something to himself. Once or twice he looked sharply over his shoulder. The only other occupant of the room was a large black cat, which was pacing to and fro in regular quarter-deck fashion, on the side of the room farthest from the fire. But for the light catching its eyes from time to time, I should not have known that it was there. They glowed very green and very bright. It seemed fairly clear that the man was expecting a visitor, and not a welcome one either. This suspicion was confirmed when he got up, tried the fastenings of the shutters, and satisfied himself that the door was locked and bolted. When he sat down, he mixed himself another drink. Before he had finished it, a very strange thing happened. I saw the key in the lock of the door turn, and I saw the bolt slide back. I am as certain of that as I have ever been of anything. The door opened slowly, and a man came in. Of course it was the first man I had seen on the beach, and I did not like him any the better at closer quarters. He did not take off his hat or turn down the collar of his boat cloak, so I could make no more of his face than I had before, but I was quite sure that two more unpleasant characters can seldom have been found in the same room. The little man was obviously horribly affected by the entrance of his visitor, but he stood up as if determined to put the best face upon it. By this time, I think he was at least half drunk, or, as he might have put it himself, 3 sheets in the wind. The men did not shake hands and no word was spoken. The newcomer drew up a chair to the table and produced a pack of cards. The little man turned himself towards it, and they began to play. The cat jumped up upon the table and sat watching with a baleful stare. I do not know what the game was and could not follow it very well, but it became clear that the ace of spades was the master card, and the visitor held it every time. As hand succeeded hand, the face of the little man became more and more ghastly until it was hardly human. If a cat can laugh, I swear that that cat, which I was coming to dislike as much as either of the men, was laughing to itself. Suddenly the visitor stood up. He seemed to have grown larger and his head almost touched the ceiling. He was between me and the lamp, and his cloak seemed to fly out like the wings of a great bird, so that I could see nothing but blackness. I thought I understood what is meant by darkness, which may be felt in the account of the 9th of the plagues of Egypt. When the scene cleared, there was a new picture. I was looking at a churchyard which I had no difficulty in recognizing. There was an open grave and a man standing near it, presumably the sexton. One detail struck me as curious. There were several spades lying on the grass beside him, as if a whole party of diggers had been at work. Then I saw the funeral procession headed by the clergyman approaching from the lich gate. It came straight towards the grave. The corpse was not to be taken into the church. The coffin was carried by 4 bearers, and there were no mourners following. As soon as the service was over, each of the bearers took a spade and helped the sexton to fill the grave in. All 5 men worked with immense energy, as if there were not a moment to be lost. The clergyman, this also I thought unusual, stood by and watched them. As soon as the work was finished, the party dispersed as rapidly as was consistent with decency. In fact, they might almost be said to have run away. Once or twice, while this was going on, I thought I saw a figure of some kind just outside the lich gate, but it was so indistinct that I could make nothing of it. I could not even be sure whether there was anybody there at all. When this picture disappeared, I felt sure there was nothing more to come, and soon afterwards the maid came in to lay the table for supper. As this was my last evening, I had Mr. Rust in later to help me pass it. We talked of general matters pleasantly enough, and no mention of Henry Rigg was made, but I think we both felt the other was somehow on guard. Next morning I returned to London. Well, there is my story. I could not make it more interesting except by some unwarrantable excursion into the realm of romance. I cannot pretend to say why my adventure, if you can call it that, befell me, nor to explain any of the details, but I think I can guess why Henry Rigg was not popular in his lifetime, and why his memory was still odious in the pleasant little village of H, more than 30 years after his death. And I have sometimes wondered whether the text which the lawyer from Saxmundham had placed on his tombstone had any secret and sinister significance. The end. The sea keeps its own counsel. As generations pass, churches weather and memorials fade beneath the touch of time. Yet some deeds leave an imprint deeper than stone. In Malden's story, the boundary between memory and haunting becomes almost impossible to discern. Are we witnessing a ghostly visitation, or merely the lingering power of lives once lived with extraordinary courage? Like many of the best traditional ghost stories, the Coxwain of the Lifeboat offers no easy answers. Instead, it leaves us with the unsettling suggestion that the past is never entirely past, that acts of heroism, tragedy, and devotion may continue to echo long after the last witness has gone. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the strange and shadowed world of R.H.Malden. Until next time, when another forgotten tale waits in the darkness beyond the firelight, this is Christopher Halton, bidding you good night. For several years, I've devoted myself to creating original ghost stories, strange tales, atmospheric narrations, and supernatural fiction through haunted tales of darkness. What many people perhaps do not realize is the amount of work involved behind the scenes. The writing, editing, research, recording, artwork, publishing, and production that goes into trying to create something worthy of the great tradition of classic supernatural storytelling. I continue to do it because I genuinely love the work. Some months ago, however, YouTube effectively removed my ability to earn revenue from the channel, claiming that my content was somehow inauthentic. I was far from alone in this, as many other readers, writers, and narration channels were similarly affected. Ironically, this has happened at a time when the platform itself is increasingly flooded with AI-generated material. Part of the issue, I suspect, is that YouTube strongly favors midstream advertising, which is completely at odds with the kind of immersive storytelling experience I try to create. Interrupting a ghost story midway through with loud advertising breaks the atmosphere and destroys the flow for both reader and listener alike. A number of people have asked whether there is another way to support the channel and my writing directly, and that would be by supporting me through Patreon for anyone who wishes to help support future stories, books, narrations, and projects. There is absolutely no obligation, of course. Watching, listening, commenting, and sharing the work already helps enormously. But for those who would like to contribute monthly or simply leave the occasional gift of support, it would be deeply appreciated and would directly help me continue creating new material. Thank you to everyone who has followed and supported Haunted Tales of Darkness over the years.